So good evening, everyone. Welcome to our October meeting for Data in the Greater Good. I'm Elaine Gamble, and I'm the community leader for Data in the Greater Good, and we're a community of nearly 2,000 people whose passion is the use of data in mission-driven organizations and the use of data to help humanity, whether it's the arts, education, social justice, healthcare, among other areas. And we've really had phenomenal organizations come and talk to us about how data is advancing their mission. Really excited tonight to have with us Datakind and a partnership they have with the Future of Property Rights program at New America, a think tank in Washington, D.C. So I'm joined by my co-organizer, Bill Prickett, who is also leading the video recording of tonight's event and this virtual experience. Thank you very much, Bill. So a little bit more about tonight's two organizations that are partnered and will be giving us a talk tonight on addressing housing loss during COVID-19. Datakind is a global nonprofit that harnesses the power of data science and AI in the service of humanity. Named one of Fast Company's top innovative nonprofits, they help mission-driven organizations unlock their data science potential ethically and responsibly. And their team of pro bono data experts are visionary change makers that collaboratively part with organizations to tackle some of the toughest social challenges. And they are joined tonight by the Future of Property Rights program in New America, a think tank that looks at land, housing, and property rights challenges, both in the United States and abroad. They use the power of convening, research, mapping, and media to expose and address existing and emerging housing and land rights challenges. So these two organizations have partnered on a study around housing loss. Each year, nearly 5 million Americans lose their homes through eviction and foreclosure. These forced displacements are intensely traumatic financially, physically, and emotionally. Children have to switch schools, parents lose their jobs, families' possessions end up on the sidewalk, and suicide rates spike. Yet, as our nation braces for a tsunami of housing loss as a result of the COVID-19 economic fallout, we know very little about these life-changing events. Where is forced displacement most acute, and why does housing loss occur? Who is most at risk, and what happens to people after they lose their homes? So here with us tonight are two subject matter experts in the area of data, as well as analyzing this area, to talk with us about addressing housing loss and how we can support local and state governments in helping communities. First, Emily Yelverton is from Datakind. After graduating in 2015 from Stevens Institute of Technology with an MS in Applied Mathematics, she began her career as a data scientist in the education sector. However, the Data for Good movement was too enticing for her to ignore, and she began volunteering for Datakind and then transitioning to consulting the following year. She lives in New York City metro area, writing and producing films. Tim Robustelli from the Future of Property Rights program at New America. He's a policy analyst. He previously interned for the International Wallenberg Foundation in New York. He graduated summa cum laude from the University of Vermont with a major in history and also received a master's in international relations from New York University. He has written for the Washington Post, The Hill, CNN, among others. So please join me in welcoming Emily and Tim speaking on addressing housing loss during COVID-19. Before we go into their talk, if you have questions, you can type them into the chat box, and during our Q&A, we will either call on you to share your question or I will share it for you. So on that note, welcome Emily and Tim.
Thank you. Elaine, thank you very, very much for having us. Bill, thank you so much for your technical expertise. For everyone on the call, thank you so much for joining, and thank you to those of you who might be watching this recording later. Like Elaine said, my name is Emily Yelverton. I'm a data scientist at Datakind. I'm joined by Tim Robustelli, a a policy analyst at the Future of Property Rights program at New America, and we are here to talk to you today about housing laws. So I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to talk to you today about how the global community of Datakinders work with amazing organizations such as FPR to leverage their data for the greater good. But before we do that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Datakind. We were launched in 2012. We're headquartered in New York City. We're a global nonprofit that harnesses the power of data science and AI in service of humanity. We bring together talented pro bono experts from academia and industry, together with visionary change makers to collaboratively design innovative solutions to tough social problems. We attempt to bridge that gap between technologists and the social sector, and we're a nonprofit that connects pro bono data scientists with mission-driven organizations. This gives data scientists a chance to work on problems for social good, social organizations a chance to maximize their impact in the process, and it gives us all a chance to live in a better world. We work alongside project partners to apply their data to predictive analytics, machine learning algorithms, and AI needs in a way that both increases impact and is sensitive to ethical considerations that they have. And after understanding the problem and questions surrounding the availability and quality of data, we recruit and manage teams of pro bono experts to build readily actionable and ingestible solutions. But we are only able to do this because of our global network. We have 5 chapters all around the world in San Francisco, New York City, the UK, Bangalore, and Singapore. And most of these chapters are entirely volunteer-led and run, and we could not do this work without them. Over the years, our community has grown to include over 20,000 members in 98 countries. And we estimate that we've delivered over $35 million worth of pro bono data science services to social change organizations all over the world. Quickly, a little bit about what sorts of projects we do. So regardless of what the project is, preceding the program, we spend a considerable amount of time working alongside our partners to engage them in problem discovery, understanding organizations' theory of change, addressing data quality issues, and then after that comes the real work. So we have a couple of different programs that we engage partners with, the first of which is data core projects, which are longer term, like 4 to 8 months engagements, in which we use data science to help transform their work and their sector. And then the second is data dives, which are weekend-long hackathon-style events that help organizations do stuff like initial data analysis, exploration, and prototyping. And now I will turn it over to Tim to talk about the Future Property Rights project that we conducted together, which was actually one of the longer-term data core projects that we started working on last year. So Tim, tell me when to go.
Thank you, Emily. And yeah, I'll just let you know when we can move to next slide. And thank you to Bill and Elaine as well for giving us this opportunity to share our work. So before I jump into the actual project, I'll just share a little bit more about New America and the Future Property Rights program. New America is a DC-based public policy think tank. We have offices in Oakland, California, Indianapolis, Phoenix, and Chicago. We believe that there's 3 things that set New America apart from other think tanks in DC and the Beltway. The first is an emphasis on journalism. We take pride in our storytelling and translating some more policy-heavy issues into things more accessible to wider audiences. The second thing that we believe sets us apart is we try and engage with stakeholders across the United States instead of just speaking with people and organizations in Washington, D.C. or San Francisco or New York City. And finally, we really emphasize getting different stakeholders into the same room. The 2 that we focus on most are really getting policymakers and technologists to really speak with one another, because often they're working towards the same problems, but often in different silos. So we do our best through convenings and other activities to get them talking to each other a bit more. The Future Property Rights program deals with both international and domestic issues. In the past year and a half, we've really turned our focus to housing issues in the United States, specifically that of housing loss, whether that be through evictions, mortgage foreclosures, or lesser known mechanisms of housing loss. And this report was a partnership between Datakind and New America, as well as some of our partners in our case study locations, Wake Forest University, Winston-Salem State, Arizona State, and IUPUI in Indianapolis. Next slide, please, Emily. So what motivated us to start this work? You heard Elaine touch upon the fact that millions, we estimate 5 million households lose their homes each year, but little is known about where housing loss is most acute. And that's because there's a blatant lack of data and information at a national level when it comes to both evictions and mortgage foreclosures, which are the primary mechanisms of housing loss in the US. So we really set out to better understand what scale housing loss was happening at, where it was happening, and who it was happening to. And we not only wanted to look at evictions and mortgage foreclosures in silos, we wanted to take a more holistic view of housing loss in the United States. And we started this project last year when no one was predicting the outbreak of COVID-19 in March. So given widespread unemployment in the United States and increased housing insecurity, this kind of work really took on an increased importance for us. Really knowing, one, giving us a baseline of what previous housing loss looked like as we studied the years between 2014 and 2018, but also using that historical housing loss as a tool for policymakers and housing advocates to know what communities, what neighborhoods have historically been affected by housing loss. And so then they can take that information and direct housing assistance, outreach, and other resources to help people survive the pandemic. Next slide, please. So again, I'll just touch on this. This was our scope of research. We looked at housing loss across the United States at the county level. We were able to capture data for about 2/3 of all US counties. And then we also did case studies, sort of diving down to the census tract neighborhood level in Indianapolis, Indiana, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and then the Phoenix metro area in Arizona. Next slide, please, Emma. I'll actually turn it back over to you.
Yeah, so I will tell us a little bit about the data we had available and the work we did to get it into shape. So we had three main sources of housing loss data: evictions, mortgage foreclosures, and tax lien foreclosures. We were able to source eviction data, which is open sourced from the Eviction Lab, and then FPR worked with local partners in the three deep dive areas to source that data for at a more granular level, so they could, put together more in-depth insights about a census tract level housing loss. And then the fourth data set that we had available was 5-year American Community Survey data, which we sourced from the census.gov API. And the reason why we got all of that data is because we wanted to put together the housing loss data together with the census variables to try to get at exactly what sorts of people are affected by housing loss. So we put together a really awesome volunteer team to collect the census data and put everything together in a way that could be visualized. So basically what happened was the volunteer team had to figure out a way to clean and parse all of the data. Sometimes they had to geocode raw addresses for the deep dive sites. Then they had to create master data files that could feed into the analysis and the visualizations. So this involved creating a GitHub repository with a lot of Python code. They wrote code to extract the ACS variables from the census API. They wrote code to clean and process the data, calculate different housing loss metrics, and finally output the final files that are used in Data Wrapper, which is a data visualization platform commonly used by data journalists. And I will turn it back to Tim to talk to you about the housing loss metrics.
Sure. So I'll touch on our methodology very quickly. From the quantitative level, we were able to combine rates of evictions and foreclosures for each US county and in each case study at each census tract, and normalize that by dividing by the number of renters combined with the number of owners with a mortgage. And that allowed us to compare different counties at the national level and different census tracts or neighborhoods in our case studies with each other to find out where loss was worse. And we also wanted to supplement sort of the statistical data-driven story with information on why people are losing their homes, sort of what that impact is when they're displaced after as well. So we actually conducted over 100 key informant interviews throughout our 3 case study locations. Next slide, please. So I'll just touch briefly upon our national findings. Next slide, please. So what you see here is actually a map of our data coverage across the United States. And when it came to obtaining both eviction and foreclosure data, we were only able to get that information for roughly 2,200 US counties, or 2/3 of the country. And what this shows is that there are significant data gaps still existing when it comes to housing loss across the United States. And we think that's a big deal. As Elaine said in her introduction, it is a traumatic experience for families before home loss and after, and it affects entire communities as well. Next slide, please. So what you see here is just a heat map, more or less, of housing loss across the United States for the years 2014 and 2016. What's shown is basically just the rate of loss compared to the national average. The darker it is, the more acute housing loss was in the county. We were able to do some interesting analysis as well, sort of aggregate the rates to the state level. And what we've seen is that states in the Southwest and the Southeast, perhaps unsurprisingly, were some that were experiencing the highest rates of loss. And this, of course, can guide policymakers in allocation of fundings, policy interventions, and the like. Next slide, please. And so what Datakind was able to do was to break down that map you just saw a bit and create a really cool index where they would take the housing score and basically compare it, to the national average. And so what we were able to do is we were able to rank those 2,200 US counties based on the severity of their housing loss. So in this slide, you'll see that number 1 is Petersburg City, which is an independent city in Southern Virginia. And based on the data that we obtained, it experienced a housing loss rate on average between 2014 and 2016 of a little over 12%, which means 12 families out of 100 are losing their homes every year. And that's 6 times the national average. And so this tool is available online, You can play around and search different counties, different cities to see where your state or your community ranks on this. And I encourage you to do so. It's on our website. Next slide, please. And so just to break it down a little bit more, I'll move through these next slides quickly, but we also felt it was important to understand where housing loss was affecting homeowners and where housing loss was affecting renters. And that, contributes to policy formulation, whether at the local, state, or federal level. And again, the Southeast with Florida in particular, and the Southwest were places that were exhibiting the most severe rates of mortgage foreclosure. You also see the Northeast and then the Great Lakes as well. Next slide, please. And then evictions, and I'll just touch on this quickly, that the Southeastern United States displayed regionally some of the most severe rates of eviction across the United States. But I will note that there are significant gaps in the data. You'll see on this map that the Dakotas and Arkansas and Alaska, large parts of Louisiana are lacking data, upstate New York even. And that lack of data, that data gap, really creates a gap in knowledge when knowing who's affected by home loss in those areas.
Right, because part of the story here is that, FPR was able to meet with, local leaders to try to figure out, where in their exact neighborhoods are homes being lost. And in more than one case here, they were able to help allocate CARES funding for COVID housing loss due to some of the work being done here. So we are not able to do that in these states where we don't have data. So a big takeaway from this project is that we absolutely need to find a better way to collect this data, because if we can't be informed about the issues, then we can't do anything about them.
Exactly, Emily. Thanks for raising that point. And just something I'll quickly touch on is that throughout analysis of 17 counties dispersed across the country to account for warm weather and cold weather places, we found that evictions actually spike in the summers. And that could be due to a number of things. Children are out of school, so there might be increased childcare and grocery costs. It's a busy time of year when people are moving in and out, so landlords might be trying to evict tenants and sort of raise the rent for the next family coming in. But trends like these sort of inform, when funding has to reach vulnerable households, and when housing organizations, nonprofits sort of need to be on their toes for significant uptake of homelessness populations and the like. Next slide, please. So I'll just quickly touch on the case studies. And as Emily mentioned, what we were able to do here was really dive into who housing loss is affecting most using those ACS variables. Next slide, please. So again, our case studies were in Marion County, Indiana, which is coterminous with Indianapolis, Maricopa County, Arizona, which is the Phoenix metro area. It includes Glendale, Tempe, and Mesa. And then Forsyth County, North Carolina, which is home to Winston-Salem. So what we were able to do here is dive down to the census tract level and really find out where loss was occurring in these communities. And I'll just note, based on our analysis, that evictions accounted for 3/4 or more of all housing loss during the study period across all 3 case studies. So certainly renters are more vulnerable than homeowners to housing loss. Next slide, please. So through this correlation analysis using ACS variables, we were able to pick out some things that perhaps aren't so surprising given long-term racial discrimination, inequity, and discrimination in the housing space. So the data core team was able to run correlation analysis at the census tract level, basically just testing relationships, and found that across the case studies, census tracts with more Black households, and census tracts with more Latinx households experienced higher rates of housing loss, especially in comparison to census tracts with majority white households. And something else I'll raise is that census tracts with households that lack health insurance, so that may be correlated with immigrant status or low-income jobs, also displayed higher rates of housing loss. Next slide, please. And so, as I mentioned before on the methodology slide, we not only wanted to understand how people were losing their homes and who, but what were the factors behind home loss, and then what were the factors, or what were the consequences, after home loss. And I'll move through these quickly, as I know this is a call emphasized on data. But what we found is that tenants have really poor rights. Renters, have no shot going to court up against the landlords that have lawyers representing them most of the time, while tenants do not. Sometimes tenants aren't even notified of their court date, which results in just sort of a bit of a summary judgment. And even if they can get there, if they do know their court date, they often have to find childcare or use unreliable public transportation to get down to the courts, take a day off from work. So there's severe power imbalances in the rental space. It varies state by state, but overall landlords have a lot more agency and power than tenants. Next slide, please. And I'll quickly touch on some of the impacts, and we've touched on these earlier in this chat. But when people lose their homes, it really sends their life into a spiral. Based on our key informant interviews, we've heard it described a couple different ways. Someone in Indianapolis, frankly, described it as just continuously swirling around the toilet bowl after you lose your home, and someone else termed it as crisis mode, where sort of the house is the base, and once that goes, children's education may suffer, or high stress levels may lead to underperformance at jobs, and that may cause a firing. So we see these sort of long-term, or these problems compounding that often start with home loss. And it's not just at the family or individual level, as we've mentioned, it also affects entire neighborhoods, whether that's neglect, a decrease of property values, an increase in crime. Next slide, please. And so I'll just quickly touch on policy recommendations, and then we can talk about some of the impact that we've had after the release of this report. So as we discussed, there's very bad housing loss or data on housing loss across the United States. We think that definitely needs to improve. That way we can better scale up the problem and create data-driven interventions and policy solutions. There needs to be proactive policies to keep people in their homes. It's not enough to deal with homelessness or deal with a displaced family after they lost their home. It's much more humane, efficient to try and keep people from losing their homes in the first place. And that comes through expanding affordable housing options. The affordable housing crunch has been in the news for the past couple of years. We need innovative ways to increase housing stock and drive down very high prices. And then tenants need more rights or more power in the courtroom to give them a better shot of staying in their house if they do slip behind on the rent or if they have a disagreement with their landlord. Next slide, please. So Emily mentioned these briefly a few minutes ago. It's just some early uptake that we've had on this data, and it's been great. And we've been lucky enough to link up with the city of Tempe. We briefed city councilors there as well as the mayor's office, and they use their report findings down at the census tract level to target aid both for rent and utilities to some distressed neighborhoods amid COVID-19. And sort of going back to the lack of legal representation on behalf of tenants, they sort of heard about that issue and started thinking about pro bono tenant representation in some of the worst affected neighborhoods for housing loss in the city, which was great to see. We've also briefed the Mayor of Phoenix's office as well as the Governor of Arizona's office. So it's been great to engage with those stakeholders and give them some hard data to address these problems and go to other elected officials to get something done. And then in Indianapolis, we've had similar success where a deputy mayor we met with took these findings to his colleagues, and they were able to use it to better help allocate CARES funds in the early summer. Next slide, please. So what's next? I'll quickly touch on this, and Emily, feel free to chime in because I know we are continuing our work. But one of our largest findings, and as researchers, something that we want to work towards solving is how do we get rid of poor data, or how do we improve the quality of data when it comes to housing loss across the United States? And that's not going to take someone in a DC office sort of pointing out the problem. It's going to take everyone involved in the issue, whether that's the clerks in courts, government officials, the GIS people in offices across the country. So we're going to hold a few workshops to sort of talk about this problem and hopefully move to a solution. Emily, do you want to just talk a little briefly about the next step or the next bullet point? Excuse me.
Yeah, so we really would like to expand on this work. So what Datakind has done in recent weeks is recruit a team of over 20 volunteers just to help source data, because we had to work with our deep dive partners in the three counties to basically extract data for them. So in order to expand this work and get a more granular idea of what's going on in a bunch of different cities across the country, Datakind recruited a team of volunteers to collect some of this mortgage foreclosure and evictions data. And a lot of the time that was pairs of volunteers teaming up and literally getting on the phone and calling mayor's offices and asking whoever they could talk to, you know what, we're doing this really important project. We need to figure out who is being evicted in your neighborhood. Can you help us achieve this? Can you help us get some of this data? And we've had varying success, but what we're doing is we're hoping to, you know, spread the net very widely to about 10 different counties with the goal of getting enough data to continue the analysis with another 5 or so. And then beyond.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for that. Inspiring and very informative talk. It really sheds light on the depth of this issue and something that impacts all of us. And we may think, yeah, that's somebody else, but at the end of the day, we all struggle when families struggle with housing loss during these times. So thank you for sharing this fantastic work. Okay, so the first question is housing loss. When you look at the solution in terms of the family's abilities to rebound, are there demographic considerations around that? Are there parts of the country where you see people rebound more quickly? Are there differences regarding groups of people, et cetera? And how long does it take on average for someone to rebound after a housing loss where they approach, quote, normalcy?
Sure, that's a great question. And I'll preface this with that's something that we originally really wanted to dig into in this research. We asked, you know, pretty much everyone we talked to, what happens to individuals and households after they lose their homes? And, you know, aside from the quick answer that, you know, they may end up homeless or doubling up at friends or family's houses or at a homeless, or excuse me, sleeping in their car. We got a lot of shrugs after that. There's not a very good system for tracking families over time who experience loss, at least from sort of a advocacy or housing research point of view. When someone does have an eviction filing on their record, that's something landlords can access online through vendors and platforms. But or when someone goes through mortgage foreclosure, their credit's wrecked, their finances are drained. But sort of from a long-term tracking point of view, it's not something that we've been able to nail down, unfortunately. You know, these housing losses, it's very personal, it's traumatic. It's often difficult to find an individual who's experienced this that you can talk to, or who would like to talk to you openly about this, especially as a researcher. I will say that, you know, after 2008, we're still seeing those impacts. We're still seeing families suffering after sort of the mortgage foreclosure and eviction crises that resulted from the Great Recession. We know that wealth or property is the main source of families' wealth, and that, you know, minority communities, specifically Black households, have been shut out from property ownership for, you know, decades upon decades, and that compounds over time. So that wealth gap between, you know, white households and Black households and even Hispanic households in the United States, because of that lack of access to property, in part, is just, you know, shocking and only getting worse. I know that's not the most satisfying answer, but to sum it up, I think it takes a while for someone to get back on their feet.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Another question, what organization will take forward the work? Have you been collaborating with Community Solutions, another data.org partner or a Datakind partner? So yeah, I think that's a great question. So this is, you know, very timely information. We're in a difficult period. You produce some informative results, but taking it forward so that it doesn't just remain a study, but who will continue it, its next iteration, ensuring that these findings get to local governments so they can be acted upon? Who will continue your work? Because I guess an assumption is you won't own this forever. So how's that handoff going to take place to continue sharing this so that we can act on the results locally?
Sure. That's a great question. And for the immediate next step, we're calling it Displaced in the Sun Belt, as we're finding that most of our case study locations will be in the southwestern and southeastern United States. We're going to continue to work together. I know I'm super excited to continue working with Emily and Datakind, and we're bringing in a sister organization or a sister program of ours at New America called the New Practice Lab to do that work as well. But as you pointed out, Elaine, this perhaps isn't something that we're going to do forever, and something we're thinking a bit more about is how to maybe provide a framework or provide some tools where local stakeholders can sort of find the eviction and the foreclosure data in their county, and build out these maps to inform decision making as well.
Okay. Another question, has anyone taken a look at the precursors or predictors of foreclosure, i.e. the Great Recession, medical bills, large housing expenses for those with poor credit, needing a new roof or furnace, especially for those on a fixed income or otherwise unable to obtain additional income? I think that's a great question. We analyzed kind of the situation and what happens. But what about the precursors, getting ahead of it? And where are our opportunities? I'm adding to the question because I thought it was a great question, to be proactive. Thoughts there, to intervene before someone's in this situation?
Sure, that's a fantastic question. And Emily, I will say before I jump in, feel free to chime in. I don't want to dominate the Q&A portion of the call. But precursors are something we looked at in the research. I'm not sure that came through in the presentation, perhaps as we were a bit more focused on the quantitative side of things. But whoever asked that question raised some examples that we heard time and time again throughout our research. A majority of renters, or close to a majority, please don't quote me on that, but they are rent burdened, meaning they pay over 30% of their income on rent every month. So that means a lot of them are very tightly constrained on their budgets. They're living on a bit of a razor's edge. So there's that one, what we've termed a personal shock, that could cause them not to be able to pay their rent or pay their mortgage. And that can be a medical expense. We heard that quite a lot, that an unexpected medical expense could contribute to that. It could be someone's car breaking down. It could be, if someone relies on the bus system to get them to work every day and they're repeatedly tardy, and that leads them to lose a job. Of course, they're going to struggle coming up with the rent. I will just point out something we heard in two different case study locations. Stakeholders both use the example of a flat tire pushing someone into housing loss. And I mean, how much does a flat tire cost to replace? $150 to $200? It's sort of that razor thin edge where people are living, and sort of that fluctuating source of income or budget that more times than not causes them to lose their home.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I think this really speaks to the need for a better social safety net. It's a pretty well-known statistic at this point that over 2/3 of Americans do not have $1,000 in the bank saved up for an emergency. And as Tim said, when going through some of the analysis slides, noticing that a lot of evictions take place in the summer, since we saw that a lot of evictions are happening in the Sun Belt where it gets very, very hot, kids are out of school, it's hot, they need to be in air conditioning. So, it's entirely possible that parents are having to choose between, putting their children in daycare in the summer or paying their electric bills so they can have air conditioning. So it really speaks to the need for a better social safety net, because we are all much closer to this than we think.
Thank you, Emily. Another question. What is your plan for capacity building of organizations directly affected by these policies to use the data for their own advocacy? Anything beyond the lecture series?
I'll say that our partnerships in the case study locations in Arizona and North Carolina and Indianapolis were key for us to not just parachute in as a DC-based think tank, but really engage with housing advocates, CDCs, other NGOs on the ground in these places. And, we interviewed them. We solicited feedback from them as we were building this report, and we continued to sort of engage with them during the release of the report and afterwards. And we're always looking for new engagement and ways to talk and connect with these stakeholders, because they're the real ones with the local expertise. They're the real ones who know what levers and buttons to push and pull when it comes to getting things done at the municipal and county level. So to be honest, we don't have anything too concrete in mind besides those workshops that we're excited to get going on. But it's something that we always sort of have in the back of our minds.
Mm-hmm. What have you heard about the mental health impact of housing loss, and do you feel the mental health impact is even greater with the COVID influence and the sense of isolation people might feel in a variety of ways, physically among others?
Yeah, well, there's a decent amount of studies out there in the literature that say that housing loss has been proven to have a significant impact on mental health. And that's something that I think we need to see more of. It's easy to talk about sort of housing and then mental health in silos, but they have significant impacts on each other, and it's a two-way street, right? Housing loss could have a negative impact, and stable housing could certainly have a positive impact on mental health. And I can't say for certain sort of what impacts the pandemic might have when it comes to housing loss, but I know it's had significant impacts more generally on mental health, and sort of the added stress of not being able to safely shelter in place if you lose your home amid the pandemic, I think could only exacerbate some of the ways that people are feeling right now.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, most people receive health insurance through their jobs. And, even if you do have health insurance, mental health counseling and medication are prohibitively expensive, even if you do have that barrier of insurance. And, because so many people over the course of this crisis have lost their jobs, with that comes a loss of health insurance. So, that only speaks to the greater need for mental health services, because it becomes even more out of reach once you've lost your job.
Yes. Josephine, did you want to share your question with the group? Would you like me to share it? We love to hear voices from the audience.
Yeah, I guess the question I want to ask about is this one about a number of tenants, I understand, in New York City, once the pandemic started, broke or were able to get out of their leases in New York City so that they could, get less expensive housing. I mean, presumably, they were either they lost their jobs or they were going to university, like that. So I wonder, and there are eviction protections in place right now in a number of states, I guess. So I wonder if either of you would like to comment on what you imagine will happen when these eviction protections lift.
Sure, that's a great question. And what we've seen since the outbreak and sort of governor's orders or even county or city level orders since March is that on the whole, these moratoriums have worked. Eviction Lab has been tracking eviction filings in a number of cities over the past couple of weeks and months, and compared to 2019 averages, evictions are down. So eviction moratoriums are working across the US. Of course, there's a patchwork of implementation. There's loopholes. It doesn't apply to everyone. And it varies to place to place. And then we have the CDC's moratorium, which was announced in early September, and that runs until, I believe, January 1st, 2021. And so I think the important points when it comes to all the moratoriums is that the rent's still due, right? So these people who are not able to pay aren't getting kicked out, but they just have this back rent accumulating and accumulating and accumulating. So, based on unemployment numbers are getting better somewhat. There's a great U.S. Census Bureau survey called the Household Pulse Survey, which deals with expected income over the next month. And those numbers are getting better as well on a weekly basis. But what I think we're going to see in January, and unless there's a more influx of cash or an extension of these moratoriums, is unfortunately, I think a lot of people are going to have to show up in eviction court come the new year, unless something's done. Aspen Institute right now, a month ago, came out with a great analysis. Someone there, Emily Benfer, and it's 30 to 40 million Americans are now at risk of eviction, which is just an absolutely unprecedented number.
Mm-hmm. And Josephine, you also had some additional information you wanted to share with the audience about NPR.
Oh, right. Yeah, I remembered, because, I have an interest in this for a number of reasons, this topic. And I did hear on the media, on NPR a while back, they had, I believe, a series that featured or showcased the Eviction Lab. I don't know, you probably have heard this program, but I wanted to mention it because it really, they're collecting good data, and they're able to speak about this. And yeah, they offered some very poignant stories about some of the struggles that people have because of any of a number of unseen events that impact their ability to stay in their homes. It's a very big nationwide problem. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Josephine. I wanted to explore the point about the care funds a bit. So in your opinion, do you believe that the public was misled in terms of the depth of assistance that it really provided, or did it provide assistance to a very small percentage of people, most of whom would not have been those that needed it most, which can happen? So what are your thoughts there around, again, do you feel it was a true representation, the care program, in terms of what we might have perceived it to be and what it actually was? And if it was actually supposed to get to the masses of people, what happened such that it didn't seem to get to the people most in need, given that we're in this situation now with housing?
Sure. That's a great question. And I'll say that, the CARES Act and its $2.2 trillion was, something on the scale of influx that, we haven't seen in, at least a decade, and probably going all the way back to the Great Recession, that influx of money. And, the gears of government do grind slow. There were different mechanisms for different size communities getting CARE Act funds, especially housing. So cities over 500,000 were able to get their funds directly. Cities smaller than that had to wait for states and sometimes even counties to disperse the funds. So it does take a while, unfortunately, for funding to move through bureaucracy. And for someone who just lost their job, that's not a very good or fair explanation, but unfortunately it may be, how the world works. Second is we've seen those fundings or the funds, especially when it comes to housing assistance, be distributed. And as we've seen, it has helped keep people in their homes. Evictions are down. I'm sure foreclosures are down as well, especially given the increased protections after 2008 and mortgage forbearance options. So I think that the money has gotten to a significant number of people in need. We've seen housing assistance funds dry out already, and that's sort of the need for another influx of cash, perhaps another stimulus bill. But I think sort of given the scale of this problem, that obviously more people still do need to be helped.
Okay, I think that wraps up all of our questions. I want to thank our Datakind and the Future of Property Rights organization for this very thought-provoking talk. And I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. TBD on our November meetup, I will be in contact with you. And December, we look forward to hearing from Charity Water, who will talk to us about how they're using data to have clean, healthy water worldwide. So stay tuned for more details. Thank you for joining us, and be sure to tell people about us. We'd love to have them join. Good night, everyone. And thank you again, Emily and Tim.
Thank you very much. And I would be remiss if I did not do one last bit of advertising. So if you were interested by the presentation that you saw here tonight, Datakind is doing this sort of work all the time. So if you're interested in volunteering, please send me an email. I will direct you to the website. So really what you should do is please go to the Datakind website and fill out an application to volunteer, because we always need people to use their data skills for good. So thank you.
Awesome. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Good night.